Welcome to my Yoga for Beginners workshop. So I'm going to break this up into several smaller videos. Typically it's a 2-hour workshop, and I know probably none of us have the attention span to watch a 2-hour yoga video workshop all in one setting. So we'll break it up. So this is part 1, and we're just going to kick off with just some super basic concepts about yoga. So if you haven't taken a lot of yoga classes, this is the perfect place to start. And we're actually going to start with like how to take classes, props, yoga manners, all of those like super basics. So for starters, taking class, it's going to depend on where you take class, but often studios will offer mats and offer all the props you need for a class. So typically if you like to bring your mat, you can do that. However, if you don't have a mat, usually your studio has one. You just might double check on that. As far as props, they should have whatever props they expect you to use for class. And usually when you come into the classroom, studio I should say, you'll see the teacher's mat set up at the front of the room, and they'll usually have whatever props sitting out that you're gonna need for class, or they'll be like mentioning it throughout the whole like check-in process and as people get settled. So just be on the lookout for either the teacher's mat all set up, or they're there, you can ask them, or they'll be announcing what kind of props you need. And then also, as far as props go, there's yoga blocks, and there are bolsters. They're basically like a thick, dense pillow. And there are straps, and blankets are like the typical props you're gonna run into. If you're ever not sure if you want something extra, you can always grab it. Like a blanket is really handy for covering up at the end of class, or some extra knee padding. Another great thing you can do for knee padding, if you need it, is just double up your mat. So you just grab a little piece of your mat, bring it back, and you actually triple your mat by doing it that way. And you can get a little extra knee padding. Another great way to do it is just to flip over your mat from this side. If you're doing something like a low lunge, you can just flip over your mat and get a little extra knee padding that way too. So a lot of times there's not even a need for a lot of extra props, but if you're not sure, you can always grab extra. So let's move on to some yoga manners, we'll call them. So if you've never been in yoga class before, that's great. The more the merrier. And I think it's just nice to point out like a few little tips before you get started. So first off, try not to be late. Again, this depends on where you attend class, but there are studios that will lock the doors. No one's allowed to be late. It's considered pretty disrespectful really anywhere to be late, but especially in yoga class. So like I said, some studios will flat out lock the door and you can't even come in if you're late. So definitely try not to be late for yoga. If you are late and you're in a location like a studio or a gym that is fine with that, just try to enter like quietly, be kind of inconspicuous as you come in. Definitely in that case, look at what's at the teacher's mat and what everyone else has for props rather than asking. And then just, like I said, try to be quiet. Try not to snap your mat. So snapping the mat is when you like whip out the mat and place it down. Snapping mats is kind of like a faux pas no matter if you're late or not. But definitely if you're late, try to like lie your mat out nice and quietly, and grab your props nice and quietly, and just try to sneak into a spot in the room where you can fit. So that's another thing, is mat placement. So logically, if you have never been to yoga class and you're just kind of thinking of a grid, you would imagine all the mats lined up side by side. And studios are going to vary a little bit in styles of yoga, how they lie the mats out. But typically, if you stagger your mat with your neighbor, that's actually ideal, because then if the instructor is to the side, if you've all turned to the side, then you can still see. Also, for poses where you're reaching your arms out, you don't have to like compete with the neighbor and organize and kind of coordinate with them where you're going to put your arms. If you staggered your mats, usually it just naturally works out that way. And then you can honestly kind of fit some more mats into the studio too. So when you can, stagger your mat with your neighbors. And then also let your instructor know if you're going to leave early from class, because otherwise I've had a lot of occasions where somebody left early and I was worried that something was wrong, and try to follow up with them after if I couldn't like catch them leaving. So definitely let them know ahead of time, like before class, like, hey, I have to jet out a little bit early today. Again, not ideal, but life happens, so just let them know. And then if you are using studio mat or props, definitely clean it off before you leave. Every studio will have like sprays, wipes, towels, whatever it is they have. And also put away your props where you found them, which is really nice, then rather than leaving them out for your instructor to put away. And then last but not least, bring water, drink water when you need, take rest when you need. It's not distracting from class if you're resting when you need. Like you're just quietly resting, or if you need to take a sip of water. If you take hot yoga class, they have like their whole own set of rules. So check in with them, do like an introductory series or beginner, whatever they do, introduction, so that you can figure out what their specific rules are for hot yoga, because there are some, like you can only drink water at certain times during practice and things like that. Most yoga classes, you can just have a sip of water here and there whenever you need. And usually the teacher won't mention water breaks, so just take water breaks as you need them. So I think that kind of covers our yoga manners section. And just some more basics before we get into movement will be in like our next video. We'll actually move a little bit more. But just to answer some questions I get about styles of yoga. So popular styles of yoga. You'll see a big range of styles of yoga, but some of the most common you're going to see are Hatha yoga, which tends to mean you're holding a pose and then you step out of that pose and into the next pose. If it's hot yoga, again, they have kind of their own set of rules, and hot hatha can be sometimes code word for Bikram when they're not actually under the Bikram licensing, and I think recently that's all changed quite a bit. But when you tend to see hot hatha or hatha at a hot yoga studio, it tends to be the 26 postures that Bikram created. If you're not in a hot yoga studio, most yoga studios, gyms, facilities, hatha is going to mean you're stepping into one pose, you're stepping out of it, you're stepping into another. There's varying levels of difficulty under that hatha umbrella. And then if you see the word vinyasa, vinyasa technically means movement with the breath. So again, there can be a lot of varying difficulty levels under that umbrella. However, vinyasa does tend to be a little more fast-paced, and there are, vinyasa tends to include a lot of sun salutations, which we're definitely going to get into later in this beginner series here. But there are definitely a lot of sun salutations and movement with the breath, as you can imagine. If you're moving every time you inhale and exhale, not throughout the whole class, but through like a good portion of it, that can definitely increase your heart rate, and that's a lot of movement. So they can be more difficult, but they're not always. So don't shy away from all vinyasa classes. Another form you'll see is, of course, gentle, which should be pretty straightforward. Should be gentle, all levels, pretty easy to read that one. Gentle flow will include a little more movement than just your static, like seated stretches and lying on the back and so forth, but gentle or gentle flow, again, pretty all levels, everyone safe for most students. And then also we'll have yin yoga. So yin yoga is a little bit tricky because it is, you're holding a posture for 3 to 5 minutes, each posture. So some can be really nice and really relaxing. Some can be very intense. They tend to all be on the mat, so you're seated or lying down or face down for almost all of the yin poses. But they can, again, be very intense, because the idea with that 3 to 5 minutes is that you're stretching beyond just the muscle and you're getting into that connective tissue, into the fascia. So that's the idea behind a yin class. So it can be very relaxing, but it can be intense at the same time. And then basics or beginner yoga, again, pretty straightforward. Levels, some studios will use levels and some won't. Even if they do use levels, you tend in most places to be welcome to take any class that you like. And if it's a pose that doesn't agree with your body, or you're not interested in, or don't know how to do it yet, you can always sit it out and rest instead. So that's another tip I want to round back to. That's like a rundown of like some basic types of yoga that you'll run into. But one more kind of I don't know if it falls under yoga manners or not, but one thing I want to point out is that when your instructor is doing something that you either don't know how to do yet, or you're not interested in, or it just doesn't agree with your body, like my knee doesn't feel quite right when I do that pose, or whatever the reason may be, there are a lot of good reasons to not do a particular pose in a class, and that is completely fine. However, either take a resting pose, like a child's pose, we'll talk about more later, or attempt the pose in whatever fashion that looks like for you, whatever works for you in that pose. So maybe you don't come into like the 100% expression of that pose, but you can do what you can. Let's say, for example, it's an arm balance where you're balancing on the hands and your feet are off the mat. Already some eyes like got wide hearing that. But let's say, okay, maybe you're not ready to lift the feet up today. You could still make that shape and start to get the shape into your muscle memory, even if you're not ready to lift the feet. So what is frustrating as an instructor is when you look out at the crowd and people are just like sitting there, or not even trying to do the pose, or not doing an actual yoga pose, or whatever it may be. So try the pose or take a resting pose if it doesn't agree with you that day. And then if you are interested in doing other things, there are variations on certain poses, and as you practice, you'll get to know a lot of those variations. But if you're doing something completely different than what the class and the instructor is doing, then perhaps you might consider looking for another class that more fits your style, or maybe a home practice is best for you. I just say that because I know I've taught and I have students doing other things that the class is not doing, and sometimes it's fine and not very distracting, but then I've had times where the rest of the class is kind of like looking to that person and wondering, oh, should I be doing that? Because there are times in class where, for example, you're in down dog, you might not see the instructor in that moment, but you can see like the person behind you, and then they're doing something completely different, and then you think, oh, should I be doing that too? So it can be a little bit distracting. So if you're doing something different, maybe look into a different option that is a better fit for you. So with that, the next time we're going to get into some actual practice, some gentle like stretches and warm-ups and things. And as we do that, I'm going to address several common questions I get. So instead of just sitting and watching, we can like do some stretches, do some movement, and address some common questions at the same time. So thank you for joining me for part 1 of our Yoga for Beginners workshop, and I look forward to seeing you in part 2.